As Charles Livingston Bull grew up in New York, he demonstrated a real talent for art, but his father insisted he get a proper job. So from the age of 16, Bull reluctantly began an apprenticeship as a taxidermist, first in a small local museum and once qualified in Washington, D.C. After a decade of this, Bull quit and moved back to New York, where he managed to get some of his wildlife illustrations published in magazines. When he heard that Canadian wildlife author Charles Roberts was staying in New York, Bull immediately put together a portfolio of his best work and set out to convince the writer of his talent. Roberts was impressed by the drawings and convinced his publisher that Bull would be the perfect illustrator for the book he was currently working on. The Kindred of the Wild became an acclaimed bestseller, with Bull rightly receiving much of the credit, even if his name did not appear on the cover. This did Bull's career no harm at all. Not only was he Roberts' illustrator of choice for subsequent books, but other authors were getting in line to have him illustrate their books too. His success brought great wealth, and in 1910 Bull moved to a grand home and art studio with 2 acres of land, which he filled with wild animals and fish. During World War I, he designed several recruitment posters using metaphorical wildlife images, and he was also in demand for cover illustrations for any number of popular magazines. In 1915, he began a series of uncharacteristically serene and very orientally styled full-colour images for house and garden. And in the 20s, he produced a large number of wildlife duotones for country gentlemen. Bull had been primarily influenced by Japanese woodblock prints and the organic stylings of both the English arts and crafts movement and Art Nouveau. From simpler dramatic duotones to occasional full colour, Bull usually availed himself of an inked line of great sensitivity. And in his line-only spot illustrations, you can clearly see the underlying strength of the line quite clearly. Bull only lived to the age of 58, and because he had started quite late, his was a relatively short career. But he produced a large amount of work of great beauty, and most importantly, his use of emotional narrative in his work was instrumental in moving wildlife illustration firmly away from its more sterile Victorian origins into something altogether less academic. The sum total of Rea Irvin's art education was 6 months at his local art institute in San Francisco, and yet by his mid-20s he was successfully submitting cartoons to a couple of the city's newspapers and picking up other occasional commissions. In 1906 he moved east to New York, and within a few years was creating illustrations for several nationally published magazines, including Judge and, most significantly, Life. Such was the success of his illustration work for Life, the management offered him the job of art editor, which he did successfully for the next 15 years. In 1925, Irvin assisted in the creation of the New Yorker magazine, and subsequently joined the staff as its main illustrator and art editor. In his time as editor, he did of course commission many other illustrators, but the magazine resonated with his Art Deco sense of design, and in addition to hundreds of covers, Irvin also drew various illustrations, cartoons and graphic motifs throughout its pages. As usual, nobody seems able to shed any light on his working methods, so I'll make a stab at gouache with an ink outline. At close quarters you can see the irregularities in what was obviously intended to be flat colour. It might be watercolour, but that would have made getting this effect even harder. And although the colour was invariably applied with imagination and taste, it's the elegance and eloquence of his economic line work that makes the images so successful. In addition to his work at the New Yorker, Irvin also found time to create The Smythes, a comic strip which ran in the New York Herald Tribune during the early 30s. And if that wasn't enough, Irvin also illustrated the covers and contents of several popular books. In his later work, Irvin increasingly branched out in his approach to media. Where the early work had tended to the flat, posterized colours prevalent in Art Deco, by the 1940s his line work was becoming decidedly more gestural, and frequently he would use loose washes of watercolour and even dabble in other media such as wax, crayon and pastel when the mood took him. Rea Irvin stayed with the New Yorker until 1958, when at the age of 75 he retired, and by all accounts lived happily in the Virgin Islands for another 15 years. American illustrator Nell Brinkley was a high school dropout, and with no formal art training whatsoever, was already illustrating professionally at the age of 16. By the age of 20 she had produced the cover and line illustrations for a 1906 children's book, Wally Wish and Maggie Magpie, and around the same time she was also drawing regularly for the Denver Post and the Rocky Mountain News. Her first major breakthrough came in 1907, when media mogul William Randolph Hearst saw some of her newspaper work and was impressed enough to convince her to move from Denver to New York. She began working in the Manhattan offices of the New York Journal, where she produced many illustrations with her own commentary almost daily. The newspaper's circulation boomed, and she was rapidly gaining popularity for her breezy, entertaining creations. The curly-haired everyday working girls she drew, which she modelled on herself, soon came to be known as the Brinkley Girls, and they became a very popular cultural phenomenon in the United States. In 1918 she launched her immensely popular Golden Eyes and Her Hero Bill, a series of single-page full-colour covers for American Weekly. This was followed by Kathleen and the Great Secret, which ran from 20 to 21, and from 1921 to 24 she created another series of full-colour one-page adventures called Betty and Billy and Their Love Through the Ages. This recounted the various love affairs of a constantly reincarnating couple. When Brinkley used colour in her work, it was invariably with delicate washes of luminous watercolour and inks. But as with many who used transparent colour, her swirling, agreeably melodramatic style was almost exclusively defined by her line work. In the 1930s, Brinkley officially retired from the spotlight, even though she was only herself in her 40s, but she did continue to illustrate books when the mood took her on occasion. When she died in 1944 at the age of 58, she had practically been forgotten by her previously adoring public, and despite the attention she had received at the height of her success, very few now remember her or her work. Walter Trier was born to a middle-class Jewish family in Czechoslovakia, and in 1906 he entered the prestigious Royal Munich Academy. Once he had graduated in 1910, he moved to Berlin, where he soon found work with the satirical magazines Simplicissimus and Jugend. A year later, he also began a professional relationship with Lustiger Blätter, which lasted well into the 1920s. In 1927, Trier was commissioned to illustrate Eric Kastner's story, Emile and the Detectives. This proved to be a particularly successful partnership, and the two worked together on many subsequent illustrated books, including more of Emile's adventures and Kastner's retelling of Puss in Boots. Being Jewish, Trier was understandably alarmed by the growth and dominance of the Nazi Party in 1930s Berlin, so wisely he emigrated to London in 1936 while he still could. During the Second World War, Trier gladly helped the British Ministry of Information, producing anti-Nazi leaflets and political propaganda. And in 1947 he became a British citizen and moved to be with his daughter and her family in Canada. Amongst many other achievements, Trier provided the front cover design for every issue of the British Lilliput magazine from 1937 until 1949. Every illustration featured the same three elements: a man, a woman and a dog, and it's a testament to his creativity that he could come up with so many amusing and attractive variations on a theme. And throughout his career, Walter Trier used all sorts of media in his loose, playful images. There was watercolour and gouache, and frequently he would mix these with coloured pencils and crayon. And there was invariably his deceptively casual ink line holding the whole thing together. Trier also illustrated several of his own books, such as the charmingly idiotic Dandy the Donkey in '43 and the now unfortunately titled 10 Little Negroes the following year. And not long before his death, he published a couple of charming absurdist books under the banner Crazy People, and they sold well across Europe. When Trier died in Canada of a heart attack in 1951, he left a vast amount of charmingly eccentric and influential cartoon illustration, which deserves to be so much better known. Italian Gino Boccasile lost the sight in one eye in an accident when he was still a child, but monocular vision didn't hold him back as an illustrator of immense talent. Having studied art for a couple of years, he moved to Milan in 1925 and managed to get a job in the studios of the prestigious Mosan Morsenti advertising agency. For several years there, he created posters and press ads and developed a reputation, particularly for his paintings of provocative, beautiful women. In 1932, he moved to Paris and began a highly successful relationship with Paris Taboo magazine, producing yet more shapely girls in a variety of sexually alluring poses for many of their covers. A few years later, he returned to Milan and set up his own agency with a business partner. In this period, he was incredibly busy, and in addition to his agency work, he also illustrated several racy Italian magazines with his trademark beauties and quite a few book covers, most of them historical melodramas. Like many in Italy, Boccasile had become an ardent supporter of the fascist dictator Benito Mussolini, and by the late 30s he started producing propaganda for the government. And once war had begun in 1939, Boccasile took on a high-ranking role in the Italian SS propaganda division, and the messages contained in his images became increasingly unpleasant and continued until Italy surrendered and Mussolini was dead. Boccasile was put on trial for his part in the war, and although he was acquitted of anything criminal, none of his former clients would have anything to do with him. The only work he could find was producing hardcore pornographic illustrations, and as I don't particularly want to get banned for indecency, you'll just have to use your imagination. Amazingly, Boccasile's career did revive a couple of years later, and as well as more advertising work, he was commissioned to produce a series of lavish erotic images for an edition of Boccaccio's medieval tale, The Decameron. But his revival turned out to be rather brief, as he died unexpectedly in 1952 at the age of only 51, and the work was published posthumously 3 years later. It's unfortunate that Boccasile's anti-Semitic and racist wartime propaganda has done irreparable harm to his reputation, but it shouldn't blind us to what is otherwise a body of beautiful and influential painted illustration. See you next time.